I'm Wendy McNeil, HAVAN CEO, and it is my pleasure to welcome you today to a special episode of Measure Twice, Cut Once. And we are going to be sitting down with Brad Jones today, who is the Chief Development Officer with Wesgroup Properties. And we're going to have a conversation about one of the most important things that we're facing today is housing. Brad brings a wealth of experience and information and really a boots on the ground perspective on what's happening with housing today and really talking about practical solutions as well to really help what's going on in the industry and bringing up supply and hopefully costs down in the future. And Haven has now celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2024, and it's clear just how much has changed over the span of 50 years. Back then, I think most when we look back, it was an easier approval process, costs were lower, and really the journey from blueprint to front door was much, much quicker. But when we fast forward today, we see that the navigating the high cost of construction, government fees, and really the complex building solutions and practices that are putting on more red tape and barriers, I think is really having a big impact on housing demand and delivery, but also there's a assumption that we can do this all and also be affordable. So this we want to talk a little bit today. So this is what we're here to unpack today, Brad. So thank you so much for joining us and
Thanks for
welcome
having
to
me.
the podcast.
Thank you.
All right. So we talked about a little bit that it's been 50 years for Haven. So in your point of view, what has changed over the years in terms of housing and delivering housing?
I mean, I've heard it's changed a lot. I haven't been around that long. But, I think even through my career, I look back at just the layers of complication that have been added on. And a simple way to look at it is when you used to do a project, 20 years ago, an architect kind of ran the project. And the development company probably didn't have a full team of development folks and approval specialists and all of these specialized groups. And now when you're doing a project, you have a specialized team of 15 to 18 consultants, all with individual scopes and your, hundreds and thousands of pages of application files go through 20 or 30 different review groups in the city, each of which conflict with each other, and there's no hierarchy to. And so I think it's just been a layering of complication of kind of all systems. And I think, there's a new book, Abundance, that's popular now, and they call that the everything bagel, where, you want every single thing, but it impacts the outcome of the whole.
No, that's a good point. It seems like nothing is simple these days, and it's just difficult for difficulty's sake almost, right? So
Yeah,
it's hard to.
there is no simple project anymore. And even I actually find in a lot of cases, a townhouse project's more complicated than a tower.
Interesting, even the 40 stories, and that's
Yeah, those are actually easier than the couple townhouse projects I've worked on in the last few years. Yeah.
wow, that says a lot. So when you think about affordability and supply, there's so many different challenges. But what do you think, in your opinion, what's the single biggest challenge that has emerged since those early years?
On the affordability side, the layering has led to just an extreme cost escalation. So we roll through effectively every couple years, we have a brand new building code that we have to follow with a new energy code and a new structural code and a new electrical code. And those all update in sequences, but put together, I looked back over the last decade, we've only worked on 2 buildings in the last decade that were built under the same set of codes. And so we have no replication, no system that you can build on the last one. And usually by the time you finish construction on, project A, the systems that you put in are deemed obsolete by the code for project B, which is a pretty crazy cycle of innovation. And, that doesn't happen in really many other sectors, maybe aerospace. But we're still hammer wood together with nails in this industry. We're not aerospace.
That's right.
And so I look at it from a manufacturing perspective. It would be like Ford having to stop the assembly line every 6 months to go through a new approval process with a new safety standard and a new material requirement. And obviously they wouldn't sell trucks for a lot more if that was the case.
Yeah, I think the efficiencies and the affordability happens when you can repeat design, you can repeat longevity and materials, and it seems that, like you said, the layering of changes that are happening, maybe they're done in silos, but that is a cumulative effect that's really the big hit.
Absolutely. I've started to say the housing crisis is a choice, and that type of system is a choice. And then the extreme fees and charges that we see on housing is the highest form of taxation in our economy is on new housing, and that's a choice as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because in your video series, so Wesgroup has developed I think it's 4 videos, is it?
I believe, yes.
4
Yeah.
consumer videos
Yeah.
on homes don't just happen, which is available on YouTube. So I recommend if you want to take a look, it's a really great way to break down some complex ideas that we'll go through anyways today. But if you want that visual aspect that is really well done, it's from 2 to 5 minutes each video, and it's a
That's right.
good explainer video. So, what inspired you guys to take the initiative to put these videos together?
We really found housing is a really complex environment. So if you go to the macro level in Canada and you compare it to the US, actually, the US has national home builders that work across submarkets across the US, huge organizations. Many of them are publicly traded. And so there's this sort of cohesion, I imagine, that happens nationally on a conversation around housing, where in Canada, there's not a national home builder, and most home builders don't leave their region or their province. Maybe they work in two. But the largest home builder in Canada builds less than 3% of annual housing starts. And so we have a very fragmented industry, and there's different types of developers that are in the industry. There's, private family held companies, and there's groups that syndicate money, and there's groups that are REITs, and they all have different needs and requirements. And so there's not a single story around housing, and there's not a single answer for why it's complicated. And so it's such a hard story to tell.
Mhm.
Why is housing hard? So you have to get into approvals and construction costs and finance. And over the last 5 years, we've all had to learn a lot about shipping and manufacturing globally. Um, and so we decided we needed to distill the conversation in a bit of a different way. And we'd seen some videos in this style, and we were thinking of the old beer and taxes video that's been around for a while,
Mhm.
and wanted to just find a way to kind of bring the temperature of the conversation down, but be really information forward and tight on the timelines as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's not it's a conversation that everybody needs to understand. Like you said, it's so complex, and homeowners are part of the conversation as well. And bringing them in by providing them that information in a like like a like a teaching video, but not condescending. It's really meant to say, this is, we want to bring you into the conversation, have you understand where we are, why we are here, and maybe have their own voice projected into the conversation at government or
That's right.
local levels.
And that was definitely part of the motivation. It was actually at a Vancouver Board of Trade event that Pierre Poilievre spoke at before the election. And he wasn't speaking to our industry, speaking to another industry, but he said, talk to the people and convince them of your issue. And that was a bit of the, kick in the butt that we needed to do it. And we thought that was an interesting framing is, rather than continually explain the story to a politician, let's explain it to the public and start to kind of democratize the story of this.
It's kinda like a ground up
That's right.
approach, right?
Yeah.
Get the groundswell, get the understanding of the grassroots level, and then that is a huge influencer, in politics
Yeah, exactly.
decisions.
And so we did our first video and kind of had to learn how YouTube worked and how does the algorithm work. And
Yeah.
and the first one was too long, and our team told us it was going to be too long, but we couldn't condense it because we wanted to keep everything in there. And so it's been a funny evolution as we've gone through it.
No, technology is changing in every aspect, right? Even in trying to do explainer videos. So,
Yeah.
but they're excellent. So I do, again, recommend people to take a look and take a few minutes to watch that. And, we talked a little about why housing affordability has changed so much over the 20, 30 years. I think I think of my parents, when they purchased a home, the portion of what they spent to their wage was comparable. I think that's where the standards usually are, like 30% of
Mhm.
wage. But now we're talking about numbers that are incredibly off the scale, and there's always comments in the media and stuff that housing affordability is a crisis. There is no housing affordability. So, you know, from your perspective, you talked a lot about the cost stuff. Can you dive into that a little bit more by understanding or telling the viewers why is it so impacted, and why we're seeing these numbers?
Yeah, I think it's Vancouver's always been an expensive market by comparison. I didn't grow up here, but you can look back at newspaper articles from, through the 1900s, about how expensive the city has always been. And that gets to the constrained landmass piece. And so that's only gotten worse. And I think we all understand that. But the piece where that translates is, the base land cost to build anything is really high. So if you um, buy a group of single family homes are expensive.
Yes.
And they generally go up because there's fewer of them every year and lots of people want them. And I think we have an income problem in this region, but there's lots of people that can afford that single family home too. And so there's this big price pressure on what else you can do with land other than redevelop it. And we see the same thing with commercial properties right now that are really well located on transit, but they're worth more as a rundown shopping mall or strip mall than they are as a redevelopment site because the costs of redeveloping are so high.
Wow.
And so, the number one growing line item in a project over the last decade has been government fees and charges. It has grown far beyond hard costs. It has grown far beyond anything else, including revenues. And think about how much housing prices have gone up in the past decade.
Yeah.
Metro Vancouver fees from 2015 to 2027 will grow by 1,943%.
That's
That's a meme coin, effectively, is what it like. It's Dogecoin, but it's government fees and charges on housing.
Yeah, we actually released a report in October last year that try to highlight and really show that the 20 to 30% costing is not just it's not profit, it's not this, it's government fees are layered on, and this is probably outside of the other things that have changed like building code or
That's
other requirements that also add to the cost, but those are just the fees that they're charging you.
just the fees. So in new housing, each level of government makes more than the builder does in combination, and they make more than the bank makes by financing it. And often those fees far and away exceed land value. So we're working on a project that's an interesting example. It's in Coquitlam. Hi, Mayor Stewart. The site is worth $60 to $70 million as an older strip mall. If we redevelop it and put 2,500 units across 5 towers, it's right on transit, it's a great location, the site's worth $40 million after we take $1 billion of risk to redevelop it and pay $205 million in government fees and charges for a site that ends up being worth $40 million, or you can do nothing and the site's worth $60 million.
Yeah, that seems like a strange form of math, isn't it? It doesn't. It should be because you're creating these neighborhoods and these places to live, and meeting that demand of like, where are my kids going to live when I'm older, and just the viability and the vitality of these regions. If you just leave it as a broken, like maybe a rundown strip mall, what's that going to contribute to the community? But you guys are
Yeah.
transforming places. Like we're located down in Vancouver here, and the pockets of buildings have come up, have brought the streets alive, the
hmm
neighborhoods alive.
Yeah, it's leading to these suboptimal outcomes where 100% of nothing is nothing, and it's an unfortunate reality of what's happening with housing economics right now. And at the end of the day, developers and builders are investing in new housing, and there has to be a return on that investment, or we're not going to be able to invest, and the banks aren't going to finance the projects. And right now, the returns on doing large projects are commensurate with investing in the S&P or even a GIC at times. And so why would you take all of this risk over this prolonged period of time where you're paying, specialized people to do complicated things and going through this risky approval process, then to build something, and constructing things is financially risky and complicated versus just being a passive investor and putting it in the markets.
And I think, we talk, we hear, I guess, the nuances of people thinking that developers, the greedy developer, that really unflattering viewpoint. But I think it's important to kind of go back to that. Like, you guys are risking so much over, could be up to a decade to develop land. And we were just talking before this recording about the River District, and it's like a 40-year project, right? So there's lots of investment, lots of risk, and really everybody is in business to do well, right? And when we talk about the development community, I think we forget that the place that you live is a result of someone investing into it, right? And I think that it's really important, even for a homeowner. People are a lot of NIMBYs, which is not my backyard mentality, but once you get over that and you see something, it's like, wow, really love having that neighborhood dry cleaner that's part of my building or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
I think people are afraid. Maybe that's what it is. It's just afraid of change. But it's amazing what a development can do to just increase your values of your own property if you are close by it, or just the livability. I think those are important pieces.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to I think you're absolutely right. It's so much about change, and it's also the greedy developer piece. I think it's just misunderstood, right? It's somebody's coming in, making change, and there's a profit there, and again, there just has to be that reward for the risk. And 95% of housing in Canada is built by the private sector. So if it's not something that the private sector can do, which is what we're seeing right now, then who's going to do it? And if the government was to step in and do it, there's trillions of dollars of funding that needs to be found out of nowhere to do that. And it's a huge question mark.
Yeah.
And we're in an environment right now where next year we'll build less housing than we built in 1975 in Canada.
Which is stunning when you think about all the population growth, right? Where is
Yeah.
everybody going to live, and what's going to happen? We're just going to find ourselves into that supply risk again, where there's not enough.
That's
Currently we are, but just going to amplify, I think,
Yeah.
over the years, right?
Yeah, I think anybody that, if you do some math, you can see in 28 and beyond, we're going to have a massive housing problem because of the shortage of starts that's going on right now.
Yeah, that's unfortunate, because I think the government has been trying to be very vocal about building more housing faster, more affordable, but it's not quite hitting that mark.
Yeah, and we haven't really seen the intervention needed to do it, right? If you look at the intervention that's gone on in other industries, I think it's such a great comparison is what are they doing to stimulate other industries? And we've used this comparison a lot. So the federal government decided they wanted to stimulate electric vehicle manufacturing and battery manufacturing in Canada. They rolled out billions of dollars of grants to international companies to come to Canada and start plants and create jobs and do all these things. All of them have gone bankrupt, by the way.
Oh, goodness.
And
Yes.
the housing industry has gotten $0 of direct incentives from the government, the federal government. We've gotten a loan program. And what have we done with the loan program, CMHC's ACLP program? We've stimulated the greatest construction of rental housing since the 1970s. And so that's a loan program that the government makes money on. And so this industry can respond, but the interventions aren't at the scale they need to be right now.
Yeah. No, it's interesting, because I think that's what a lot of people see is, oh, I see lots of construction happening. Like, what do you mean there's not enough housing? But like you said, a lot of builders have decided to switch from market housing, so housing for a first-time home buyer, perhaps, or a move-down buyer, move up, into a rental product, which is needed in this region for
Absolutely.
sure.
Yeah.
But you need to have a balance. I think that's important.
Yeah, and I think we're also getting to the point where there's going to be an oversupply of rental, and we're seeing it in other markets in Canada and starting to see it in some markets here where there's been so much rental supply in some of these neighborhoods that you're actually struggling to lease up and you're having to drop rents, and then that investment isn't making sense again. And so that money, usually investment in large rental housing projects, is done by a lot of REITs, and they can invest across Canada and they can invest internationally by pension funds, and they're choosing to do that in a lot of the country right now because the yields aren't where they need to be because of the cost and revenue index.
Yeah, it's a bit of a conundrum that we're getting into. I wanted to we talked you talking in one of your videos, and you mentioned this before about housing and the cost of government taxes and fees. And in comparison, in that video, you talk about housing has been talked about as a right, a human right. Like, we need to have access to safe, decent housing, and yet it's taxed more than something like marijuana or I think it's gambling as well, which, I don't know, everyone has their own opinion on those things, but you would think for something so basic, which is shelter, that it is taxed so high. What do you think about that?
I think, I think it's crazy. Sin taxes are put in place to try to stop people from doing something, right? It's a behavior management tool. And so when we're getting to the place where taxes on new housing are in sin tax category, we have to question what our goals are out of that. And I think it's just I don't know that anyone's done the cumulative math. That's what we often find is each layer of government's not accounting for the other layer of government's piece. Um, but I think it speaks to a bigger problem that individual municipalities can't solve this issue. And it's a macro Canadian issue where Canada's interesting. There's really only a few markets that you can move to and generally move to and like get a job and live in a city and all that. So more than 50% of housing starts in Canada happen in 6 cities. And more than 40% of immigration happens in Metro Vancouver and the GTA. And so that's a national economic strategy to have an immigration program and target people coming to Canada, expand the economy, bring new workers. But then the funding doesn't follow that same formula. And so municipalities have to manage that growth. Well, they have the same financing tools they had when they were set up in about 1875, which is property taxation. And so the toolkit hasn't grown with the scope of the problem. And I think that's so much of it. But that's a big, hard problem to solve that the federal government really needs to step up and do because the system is totally broken.
Yeah, it needs to have like everybody needs to sit down of all levels of the government, just sit down in one room and say, okay, this is what we're doing. You can't operate in silos. I think that's really
Yeah.
the message is you have to work together. And in this case with housing, with industry as well. Like I know that there's a lot of solutions thrown out there, but it's just like, no, we can't do this or we can't do that. We're pointing fingers at blame, which
Mhm.
doesn't help anybody. Like let's work together. If we want to solve this crisis,
Yeah.
then we need to move together and we can only do that by doing it together.
Yeah, and it's so true, and I find it so interesting the way the various levels of government interact on housing because there's symposium this and task force that, and there's a national housing council that doesn't have a single home builder on it.
Well, that seems to be a lack of a boots on the ground perspective
I
from
would
that
think so.
group. So maybe we should help them understand that they need to bring the people who are there and living it every day because I think you guys have, it's an evolving industry anyways, and your part of your job includes finding solutions to difficult questions and having you at the table to be able to say, yes, this works, or no, this works. It would if you do this. I think that's such valuable insight that it makes sense that you would have that on
Yeah, and I think
the board.
bringing, a bank finances almost every new home that's built in this country and bringing them to the table too. They have different
Yeah.
visibility into solutions, and it's a conversation that hasn't been happening.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And you pointed out about the buildings that are moving forward. A lot of them are maybe more government funded than privately done. And for people who may say, well, can the government build more housing? You talked about how they would have to get all this, trillions of dollars potentially to build
Mhm.
these houses. Like where do people think that money will come from?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know where it would come from, and I think,
Probably
again,
taxpayers,
probably
I think,
taxpayers,
right?
but at a point it can't.
Yeah.
Um, but if you just look at it, I always go back to CMHC's ACLP program. It used to be called RCFI, and it started in 2017. And it is so financially efficient. It's a low-cost loan program. It achieves higher sustainability initiatives, higher levels of affordability in what would otherwise be a condo or a market rental project. And it has delivered tens of thousands of homes across the country in urban markets. And it's a program that's, if the government doesn't make money on it, it's at least revenue neutral.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't have, all of this transit-oriented housing if it wasn't for that program. And right now, CMHC accounts for about 50% of apartment housing starts across Canada between ACLP and MLI Select. So, if we think this industry is struggling right now and the jobs prospect is really concerning, which it is, and there could be, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of job losses in construction sector across Canada. If it wasn't for those programs, this would be an absolute economic catastrophe in Canada.
You talk about a good point about the role of construction in terms of employment
Mhm.
and really families and providing a way to live their lives. Like for Wesgroup, like how many people do you employ within your own?
Around 300.
Yeah,
Yeah.
300.
Yeah.
So if for and that's not including the other trades that you bring in, the other professionals,
That's
the
right.
people that you bring onto the site. So it'd be quite catastrophic, as you just said, if all of a sudden, we're not building anymore, and where do those jobs go? And then what happens, right? So,
Yeah, between real estate, sales, leasing, finance, construction is one of the largest employment sectors in the economy. It's larger than mining, it's larger than forestry,
mhm.
it's larger than auto manufacturing. Yet those industries get treated totally different from an economic perspective in government than the home building industry does.
Why do you think that is?
I think that they are a lot more organized than we are. They don't have the same break of concentration. So if the federal government wants to make a change to the aviation industry, they have a couple phone calls to make. And if they want to do it with the auto sector, they have a couple phone calls to make. And housing is thousands of phone calls, and it's a really complicated system. And if you look at the housing ecosystem, we work we're a lower mainland builder. There's 21 different municipalities in the lower mainland, and there's 21 different sets of policies across the lower mainland. There's a regional government, then we have provincial government policies, then we have federal government policies. And so the whole framework is so complicated. I just think when you add the geographic changes across it and the fact that the largest home builder in Canada builds less than 3% of housing, it's a really hard industry to interact with and understand because there's not one answer to a question. It's different across the country.
And there's many stakeholders that you involve, which is probably logistically impossible, really.
That's
at the end
right.
of the day,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Goodness gracious. It's a complex thing for sure. You in your well, maybe let's talk a little bit about solutions then. We talk a little bit about that, but in one of your videos talks about mass timber,
Mhm.
which is an interesting thing to bring in. So maybe just for those who are not familiar, what is mass timber, and then why do you think it's a good solution to help with the affordability and speed of construction?
Yeah, I think it could be. So mass timber is an engineered wood product where it's just basically, a press of my mass timber guy's gonna get really upset. You basically mash a bunch of wood products together to create a strong panelized or beam system that's equivalent to steel or concrete. And so if you think about us in British Columbia, we have one of the most plentiful fiber baskets. It's what the industry calls it. In the world, we have one of the greatest forestry sectors, lumber supply systems, all of that. And so you would think it would be prime time for mass timber to work in this market. But where we're at right now is if you want to do a mass timber project, you're probably better off ordering your mass timber from Europe and putting it on a ship and sending it across the ocean.
That doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make any sense. But their forestry sector operates far more efficiently with far less government intervention. And their housing system is responded to systematized design and standards, and they can repeat buildings. And so those mass timber manufacturers have a standardized set of materials and panel sizes and their entire factory set up to do that. Where our industry in British Columbia is fairly small. Most of the mass timber manufacturers in Canada have gone bankrupt, unfortunately.
Not the
There's a few
scale
that are still around.
projects, I guess.
And there just isn't, to manufacture housing, you need a really stable supply chain that's relatively fixed. It's like any other factory in the world. And housing's really lumpy and housing's really hard to time. There's a mess up in an approval and your council meeting gets bumped 2 months out, and then you can't order your timber in time, and then you lose your slot for the panels to be made. And so then you go 6 months down the chain. And so the supply chain in BC is not mature enough to respond in scale yet, but then the system's not yet there for them to respond to because mass timber buildings are different. It's a different, part of the code. Not many companies have done it yet, and certainly not at a larger scale. And so we're in this kind of infantile stage where there's a high level of likelihood that it can work. It's still more expensive than building a concrete building in a tower form. And that can change, but it takes a lot of work, and there's a lot of upfront work to really understand and optimize how mass timber works, and it takes a lot of collaboration with a city. So I think it's something that it's such a potential for the province. Not only can it build housing, it's great for the environment. Wood is a carbon sink, and also it can restore some of our forestry sector, which would be fantastic. That's suffered an immense amount of job losses over the last
Of course.
decade and longer. And I think that speaks to a bigger piece of the Canadian housing affordability problem, back to there's not that many places to move to with employment. And if we can restart some of those forestry towns in British Columbia and respond to the housing crisis at the same time, like that's a really great
That's a win-win.
win-win government intervention and incentivizing something. It's a made in British Columbia
Yeah.
housing solution.
It's really like going back to that 30,000 feet, not in the weeds, but what, it's not just the housing market, it's those that are around it that can influence. And you're talking about too, the whole efficiency piece with the constant change, you could never, it just won't work.
It wouldn't work.
But if there's more consistency, and changes will happen no matter what industry you're in, but if they are more regularly spaced out so that there is a time to build efficiencies, I think that's when you would see hopefully that magic kind of happen. I don't know. It will take time, as you said, it's an infantile stage.
It is, yeah. And I think it speaks to building a mass timber building has all the same other problems that every other housing project has, right? You still have the price affordability issue, and you have the fees and charges issue, and you have the approval issue, and you have the code issue and all of that. And it just gets back to one of the requests we've made of government is just leave us alone for a while. Just give us a stable operating environment.
Mhm.
That's not a big ask. Give us 5 or 10 years in the same set of codes to just work and simplify buildings. And I think if we had that, you could do some of the innovation work on new systems. Because right now we spend an immense amount of time just responding to new policy. We took a snapshot in 2023 and we never took it again because it's terrifying. But there was, I think there was 123 active policy consultations going on that would impact a real estate project in British Columbia. And so I think it was 16 federal and there was about 40 something provincial and then well over 100 different municipal policies being changed all at once. And so we have to understand what are all the federal tax changes, what are all the federal this and that, and the next national code. And then the province is doing a bunch of work on their system. And our whole industry has to work and read and understand that and comment on it and interact with it. And so how are you supposed to work on the next thing?
Yeah.
And being more efficient and being more innovative when you're just inundated in that?
You're just trying to survive.
You're trying to survive.
At
Yeah.
124, I can't imagine any other industry that would be having to deal with that and say, okay, well, we're fine. We're going to move on and answer all those things and
Yeah.
move forward. That's why we are where we are today, is this crisis of housing delivery.
And any one of those can cripple your project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is unfortunate because, we need more housing in this region and across Canada, but we are just not getting there, which is really unfortunate because, everybody deserves a place to live, and you can only do that when we allow that space to grow. So I want to talk about the Missing Middle initiative, which is quite interesting. It's, they've been sharing a lot of data and shedding a light on housing issues and key recommendations. So let me talk a little bit about, your guys' work with them and some of the alignment that's happening with that.
Yeah, we got to know Mike
This is
Moffat from the Missing Middle Initiative over the last year and a bit. And Mike became a pretty prominent housing economist a little bit out of nowhere. He just kind of became this guy from the University of Ottawa that was often talking about housing. And as we got to know him, his story is actually really interesting. He's not a housing economist from the beginning.
Yeah.
Mike worked at Industry Canada, and he was working on keeping and bringing industries into the country. And what he kept bumping into was housing is one of the biggest impediments, housing affordability, to having an environment in this country that's attractive to bring new companies into. The cost of living here is just so extreme that it's actually a detriment to attracting new talent. And so Mike kind of slowly started, out of curiosity and need, trying to understand what the heck is going on with this housing situation, and why is the house I grew up in now 20 times more than it was, and why is the house I bought when I bought my first house 10 times more than it was, and this just doesn't make fundamental sense. So Mike got to it through this really interesting place, and his team has really just taken a data-driven approach at looking at the systems in housing. And so one of the things at Wesgroup is we try to be super transparent with data and information because we think it helps tell the story, thus the YouTube channel and all of that.
That's right.
And so we just, as we kind of started talking to Mike, just started sharing data because it's actually hard to find historic data, even on government fees and charges going back 5 or 10 years. It just gets kind of wiped off the website. And so we've just shared data and connected Mike with other folks in the industry. And I've started kind of working on policy recommendations together, and he always has a good sense of what he thinks might be coming in the future, and he's based in Ottawa, so he hears the scuttlebutt of what's going on sometimes, which is always interesting for us. But we've built a great little relationship with Mike, and his team does really awesome work. And one of the best pieces they've done was British Columbia focused on, we call it the lowest hanging fruit in housing affordability is right now development charges are paid when we pick up a building permit before we start construction. And so that's millions of dollars up front on a project that we get a loan for, and we carry for the duration of that project. And we don't get out of that until we finish the project and get paid by all the homeowners.
That's right.
And by simply just taking that fee and charging it at the end, but having the consumer pay it like they do at closing costs, we would actually be able to drop our prices because we're trying to make a margin.
Yeah.
And so we could drop our prices, have a more attractive price, and the homeowner could still finance that in their closing costs like they do, like PTT as an example. But what that does is in BC, it actually drops a lot of homes below the PTT thresholds. There's a savings there. And then you're not paying GST and PTT on these embedded taxes that are in the price of your home. So take all of that, just the pure tax on tax savings that happens because it's paid up front. On $1 million unit in Vancouver, it saves, I think Mike's math was about $65,000.
Which is significant.
It's very
For
significant.
some homeowners, it's a yay or nay, right?
That's
If
right.
they can buy a
Yeah.
house.
Yeah, it's really meaningful. And so that's a lot of the work they've done. They do, it's very data driven. And along with a lot of other policy recommendations.
That's interesting because I think the data speaks loudly, right? So if you're able to support those pieces with data that's come across not just one person's experience, but across an industry, I think that's really powerful information.
It is, and it's not, back to the infrastructure challenge and municipalities having limited tools. That's still the same amount of money getting paid to fund the infrastructure. It's just a timing difference. And so there's lots of ways to solve that problem. And we're hoping that the feds can step up and maybe bridge finance that, which would cost next to nothing to do.
Talking about the government fees and kind of moving them later in the collection process, there was a recent announcement, I guess back in July, from the provincial government saying that what they've done with DCCs, or development cost charges, for those who are not familiar, and ACC installments, that 25% of that total amount would be paid up front when you do the building permit process,
Yeah.
or the subdivision request. And then the 75% would be moved from 2 years to 4 years, or at the time of occupancy, which you're talking about here. Does that current change the purpose of it was to help free up capital and help builders be able to shift the upfront leverage, I guess, what they have instead of tied up in DCCs. So you talk about moving to I guess development cost to consumer. Do you find this change through government policy, is that a good thing that's happened? Do you find it's maybe not enough? What's your thought on that one?
It's not enough. I think it's a good thing. My worry with it is it has a minor impact. So it's a portion of money that you're changing the carry on, but we still need to take debt on and finance it. So it actually doesn't change the fundamental math. Is it helpful? Yes. Is it going to take a project that's probably not viable and make it viable? No, it's not going to do that. So it's a change that I think is helpful, but it's not going to create, I don't think, a net new unit that wouldn't have otherwise started, where this idea from Mike Moffat's team is like a paradigm shift in the way housing fees and charges would work. If you asked me that question 5 years ago, before Metro Vancouver DCCs went up nearly 2,000%, I might have a different answer. But when the math's broken, making a minor tweak to it like that doesn't change it.
Yeah.
I think it's a great signal by the provincial government, but it's not enough. It's not going to be a meaningful change.
Yeah, it's almost like a little too late, I guess. But
A little bit, and I don't want to diminish I think they've made a lot of major moves on housing from a policy perspective. It's in a really challenging environment, and I think the implementation of some of them hasn't gone far enough.
No, I think that there's still a lot to talk about. So that's be interesting to see if they start actually considering that possibility. And it's kind of interesting because it's going back to that transparency piece too. Because when a builder is not burdened, or is responsible for that DCC payment, it's kind of behind closed doors, I would say, just by industry. So the homeowner who are listening here, or a home buyer, are kind of sheltered from that. So if you move it to when they have to pay it, as you said, like a PTT or whatever, if there are those kind of tax on tax and other pieces, I think there would be a lot more challenges from the consumer market and in our home builders or homeowners. But why am I paying all this stuff? It doesn't make sense to me. So is that also part of that strategy?
I think it's a massive benefit of that strategy is there's a level of transparency that doesn't currently exist in those fees and charges. And, that's another part of our video series we tried to get out, which is going back to kind of the developer greed pieces, is just showing people how much those fees and charges are. And we did a whole video on, if land was free and we made no profit, building a new apartment building in Vancouver would still be above traditional affordability metrics just on pure input costs alone. And so the industry can only do so much about that until a bigger change is needed. And so that's one of the most exciting parts of that idea to me about moving the timing of payment and the method of payment is you get rid of that tax on tax piece and it introduces a layer of transparency that doesn't exist. And I think it would change the conversation about how we pay for infrastructure because most people would agree property taxes are probably too low. Um, and the way that have that split in funding is a pretty regressive form of taxation where we charge new people facing the highest level of affordability structure the most
Yeah. Right. The
in
first home
taxes
buyers,
on
right?
housing. Yeah.
They're trying to just get into the housing market and with fees of that high, that's why it's such a barrier for so many people just to jump onto that first.
And same thing in rental. These fees are part of the input costs that a rental builder needs to seek a return on. We actually started when people move into a Wesgroup home, whether a condo or a rental apartment. When you move in on the countertop in the kitchen is a sheet like the gas chart at
Yeah.
the gas station
That
that has
yeah.
a list out of here's all the government fees and charges. Here's what your typical 2-bed in this building costs, and here's how much of that was government fees and charges, and here's all the things it went to.
Hmm. That's, I think, really illuminating for many people. Like,
It has
wow,
been, yeah,
yeah, it's
yeah.
kinda like that gas sticker price. I know when they first started doing those on the pump, you're shocked. It's like, "I thought this was all going to the profit of the company."
No,
No, it's not. It's
no.
actually that's not the
It's
biggest
just
profit
tax.
tier,
Yeah.
right? So, interesting. But, we talked about a little bit about, for purpose-built rental and receiving that help through that, CMHC, the apartment construction loan program. And, you talked about using that type of model for market housing. Like, what do you envision that looking like?
Yeah, I think, it's a philosophical question, I think, partly about the role of CMHC in the housing market. But I think part of the Canadian personality is that there's still like a really high interest in home ownership. And so I think it's challenging to get in and be that first time home buyer. And so there's some ideas around can there be a financing program like that that could stimulate ownership housing in a similar way? And I think that one's more complicated. But I know Mike's team's done some work on it, and it is an interesting conversation because there's also only so much rental everyone can build.
That's right.
Because there's got to be rentals more intense on your balance sheet, and condo project you're financing it through pre-sales. And then, if you don't hold the rental building at the end of the day, you need to find somebody to buy it. And at some point, I think we're going to start seeing just concentration risk of owning rental assets. These projects are getting really big. A TOD project now under the new provincial policies is like a 300 to 500 unit project. Those are really, really big assets. And I don't think there's a lot of companies out there that want to own 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 all in the same neighborhood.
That's right.
And so I think we do need to diversify more than what the last few years of housing supplies looked like for that reason.
And I think too the disruption of the first time home buyer affects every other part of the home buyer journey, right? So, your first home buyer buys into a condo, and then eventually maybe they rent their place out or they sell their place and they move up. And then, that whole continuum is disrupted at the beginning. It really bodes poorly for the future because if people can't get into their first home or they can't move out of their first home,
Yeah.
then what? Then what? Everybody it stalls and then we have a
That's right.
huge issue.
I think that's a huge part of the Canadian housing story right now is there's a segment of the population that's kind of stuck in the home that they're in. And there's a segment of that's overhoused and a segment of that is underhoused. And I think if you start combining a bunch of these solutions, you can get the older couple out of their single family home that a young couple should be trying to get into. And it creates a better housed situation. That's one thing I think the housing stats miss because they can't possibly track
Yeah, that's right.
is household formation has changed a lot. And so it's not a pure one housing unit needs to be created for one person that moves to Canada because even if there's no new population, there's people are having babies and getting divorced and getting together
Yes, life
and
happens.
and life continues to happen. And
Right.
so that creates a natural housing demand that just doesn't really get captured in, a lot of the critics of the we need more housing supply story will say, well, you know, right now we're matching population growth with new housing, but life continues to happen.
It's interesting you talk about that because I think one of the solutions that has been floating around the industry right now is kind of re-examining the foreign buyer ban.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people want to shy away from that because there have been bad stories about, flipping and just a price escalation of projects because of that investor market. But I think what's important for the listener to understand is what role do foreign buyers have on these type of pre-sale projects and making sure that they go, but also is there a way to mitigate it, create a more controlled program so that they can contribute to make sure a project can go forward,
Yeah.
but don't impact negatively the ability for homeowners in our region who live here from purchasing a home? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a very charged conversation. I know that a politician will whisper to you and tell you it's the most popular policies that they have are foreign buyer bans and foreign buyer taxes. Um, but I think the impact of foreign buyers has been significantly overstated, and I don't think it's bring the foreign buyer back and the market solved. That's an infantile explanation of the problem. I think really it's what are we losing by not allowing more investment in new housing and investment broadly? Because I think there's also an environment where we're starting to vilify even the mom and pop Canadian investor that wants to own a new apartment and rent it out. And so for us to build a new condo project, we need to get pre-sales for the bank to finance the project. And so British Columbia is also unique that we have the Real Estate Development Marketing Act that restricts the timeline in which we have to reach that pre-sale target. There's not another province in Canada that has that.
Really?
So we have a really, really hard restriction on how we pre-sell. And if you don't reach that threshold, you can either kick in more equity, which not everybody can do, and maybe the gap's too big, or you cancel the project. And when you do that, all of the local people that are trying to buy that first home, that project's now not going to happen because there weren't enough buyers for it. And so the suggestion that I like that's been made is looking at the Australia model, which allows a foreign buyer, and don't forget a foreign buyer. We have foreign buyers that work in our office that live here and they have their families in school and they're just trying to get their PR right now and they can't buy. Well, I guess they can, but they have to pay a 20% tax, which is a lot to ask.
Yes.
So foreign buyer is not what people imagine the worst scenario of it is. But it's really a question of bringing more available buyers to the table. And the Australia model allows that person to buy, but only new product. So it doesn't affect the resale market. So it generates more interest in new housing. And then on the back end, you control the use. So maybe they either have to live in it or it has to be rented out, or you just tax the use. And so there's a solution there because the goal is to get more housing built.
Exactly.
And I think we could do more to incentivize just local Canadians to invest in housing to rent out, because that's not a bad thing either. People have done that
Yeah,
for generations in this country.
that's exactly.
And even as simple as, let somebody hold the condo that they rent out in their RSP, because you can have an investment in a REIT or pension fund that invests in real estate in your RSP, but then that pension fund goes and invests in Europe because they can get a better return on real estate investment there than they do in Canada. Why wouldn't we let that local couple have that in their RSP and rent it out?
Yeah, I think it's again going back to the investment in Canada and where you live and stuff, and opening up those channels so that it's not so restrictive.
Yeah.
But you're finding maybe innovative ways where actually these are all models that other places are using. Why don't we look into examining those here?
And it just generates that net new housing that we badly need.
Yeah, exactly right. I think that's an important piece here too. And we talk about another solution too, about the temporary expansion of a temporary 3-year expansion of the existing GST and HST, new housing rebate that provides a rebate of about 100% on new housing up to $1 million and then partial for
Yeah.
that after 1 to 1.5 million. So do you feel like that would have a strong impact on housing?
I think it would. I mean, GST is 5% of the purchase price, and in provinces where there's HST, it's more.
Yes.
And it's a significant amount of after-tax dollars that you have to put in on that
That's right.
housing purchase. And so I think it's something that should be done. I think the government knows it probably needs to be done. it's an expensive policy measure for sure, but I think you have to weigh that against what's the cost of this industry like falling off a cliff. Real estate generates a significant amount of tax revenue for federal, provincial governments, and it generates a ton of employment. And so I think that's something that could be a great stimulant for the market, and it needs to be adjusted. I think the thresholds on there's no difference in GST thresholds in the most expensive markets in Canada versus the cheapest markets in Canada, and the thresholds haven't been adjusted, I think, since I was like a kid in the early 90s, and it's just crazy to think that that's just not really been touched.
Like, you look at the average price of any home, whether it's a condo or if it's a single family home, we're especially in this market, the numbers are so much more than they were back in the 90s,
Yeah.
right? So it's really the important piece of adjusting things for what things cost now. Otherwise, you eliminate so much of the housing that would qualify for that GST rebate.
Well, when that threshold was put in place in the 90s, that was a luxury housing tax, right? And now that is a tax on every new housing unit in every market in Canada, basically.
So yeah, but again, it's going back to like if you can't build the housing or sell the housing, no one gets the revenue,
That's
right?
right.
That's
Yeah.
the critical piece I think for people to understand is
And
that
not only that, the job loss has significant
yeah,
impacts across the economy and the federal budget through EI and all of that. I mean, a significant amount of job loss in the construction sector has such a ripple effect
yeah.
across the entire economy. And these are, high paying jobs for Canadians.
And it's constant, right? We've been very fortunate that there has been a lot of appetite to move here, so it's a constant stream of opportunities and jobs. And I'm sure most people can look back at their own personal circle of friends and family. I'm sure somebody in some way touches the industry, and
Yeah.
so just knowing that like your friend, your brother, your neighbor, them losing their job and what impact it would have just at that local, at that really micro level, it's really important to understand why it's such an important topic to talk about on how we can help housing and how government can help housing move forward. And just, it's really, like you said, the development community is not asking for this massive changes just for their benefit. It's like, just let us reduce these costs, just make it so that we can do our jobs,
That's right.
right?
And yeah, I think quite simply, housing construction is a massive economic generator
Yeah, of course.
in this country,
Yeah.
and we also need more housing. So if we do some work to incentivize new housing construction, there's a massive jobs economic benefit that comes out of that, as well as we have the new housing. And if we can start to bring prices down, that makes Canada a more attractive place for people to move to, which goes back to the economy piece. It starts to fill out the circle a little bit.
Yeah, it definitely does. It definitely does. And you did talk about too that the municipalities, they can't do it alone, right? There is like a housing accelerator fund, and a lot of it has to do with infrastructure funding and being able to, whether they freeze rates or they reduce rates, to be able to allow again, but they can't work in isolation,
Hmm.
right? So
Yeah, and that program, is an interesting one. I think the intent of it was maybe okay. Um, and a lot of it is about municipalities changing the regulations to be more open to new housing. I don't know that that needed $4 billion to kind of stimulate that. And I always look at what else could you have done instead.
mm,
$4 billion in the ACLP program would result in, I think, like 11,000 units of new housing. And so I question the placement of that money and the scale of that money. And we've also seen, municipalities going back on what they were supposed to in those agreements, and there's no enforcement of that. The feds are
really,
in a fight right now with the city of Toronto, not living up to their agreement, which is coming to a head, I think, at the end of the year. And so I think the effectiveness of that program is really questionable.
yeah, it's a complex topic with complex causes and solutions, but I think it's in everybody's best interest. And even if you're a homeowner and you're not living this day to day, I think it's important to understand all sides of it, because sometimes you just get caught up in the price is too high, everything's unaffordable, but you had to also ask the why. I think, and then if there's a voice for you to help move that forward, I think it's an important part of being someone who lives here and wants to find a home, or for your family, whatever. You need to also speak up as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There is lots of reasons why housing's not affordable in this market, and some of them are fixed and some of them are choices.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I'll dive into this spot, and this can be cut out if you need to. So I'll just put a note here. So just talking a little bit about speaking up. West Group's CEO. has been, Bo Jarvis, for those of you who don't know, has been very vocal and has been really taken upon yourself and as well, in talking about what's facing it. A lot of the discussion we're having today has just been vocalized from industry. It doesn't always happen because there's always a threat of, or worry, I would say, about retribution or just holding your project hostage. And also, I think the core of social media and consumers and stuff. So I say, like, that was very brave of you guys to do. I think not everybody could do it, and he had posted a LinkedIn post, which, there is consequences to doing that, unfortunately. And I just wanted to see how are things there with Wesgroup.
Yeah, I think, we set out probably a year or so ago of just kind of changing the way we interact with government and share information with the public. And so it was a big experiment
Mhm.
that included the YouTube channel, that included going on podcasts and doing this, and that included kind of sharing info we chose LinkedIn because we thought, you know, the way that network works, it'll end up getting to somebody in government who sees, what we're talking about. And so we just kind of scattershot stuff and started experimenting. And organizationally, we generally don't shy away from A, transparency, and B, conflict, and engaging in that way. But in a thoughtful way.
Mhm.
And so, it's been, I think, overall great. I'd say it's exhausting. LinkedIn is still social media.
Yeah.
And so, you kind of have to pick and choose your spots,
Mhm.
but it has been, it's opened doors to have conversations in different venues that we wouldn't have otherwise had. Actually, I had a coffee yesterday with a UBC prof who, on a what we both talk about in our work lives, you would think we have not a lot in common to talk about. And we had coffee for 2 hours, and it would have been longer than 2 hours if I didn't have to get back to the office, and found an immense amount of common ground, and are starting to talk about how can we work together and how can we come into, university planning school and share our industry's experience.
Well, that's
And so it's opened up different conversations in government. It's opened up different conversations with the banks where, we shared data and asked them to share data. And it's just created, and not that we created it, but it's, at least from our perspective, it's a much more open conversation. We also found, we don't do half measures very well, and so we went into it. And over the summer, as we're all trying to, take holidays here and there and do things like that, it's like it got to a point where it's kind of exhausting. And the other thing that happened is a bunch of other people picked up the torch and started doing it too. And so then that was a kind of allowed us to, it's like, let's just take a little time out here. And so I think we're still around, we're still doing it. And the focus is definitely being very data driven and very transparent. Try to stay out of the comment section as much as you can.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
always recommended on social media,
Yeah, that's
I
right.
think.
Yeah. But yeah, definitely a realization that LinkedIn was still social media. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit of realization, but I think it's like the ember that sparks, right? And that's
Hmm.
what you wanted. You wanted to see conversation. You opened up doors, which is really interesting. I think there might be a future opportunities or partnerships or just shifts that would have never happened if you didn't put your head above the parapet and
Hmm.
just kind of take that risk.
Yeah. And so we're now just trying to channel that in a less intense way,
Mhm.
because we also have a business we're trying to run sometimes too, and
Oh,
projects to keep going. So
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Maybe just on a little bit of lighter note, like, is there a project that you're really passionate about that you guys are working on right now?
There's a lot of interesting ones. I mean, I think we do a lot of large mixed use master plans, and those are, super complex and really interesting. But they're rewarding in such a different way. Before we started, we were talking about the River District, and
Yes, right.
I love going down there every time, because when I started, it was a site with a bunch of trees,
What a change.
and now it's, this amazing community. There's about 6,000 people that live down there, and people that I talked to at a consultation 7 years ago, now have two kids and a dog, and they're walking around and they still remember you, and you bump into them, and it's just a different place. And so the master plans just allow a totally different scale of thinking and creativity and teamwork, and it's rewarding in that way. And then, we're doing a lot of CMHC financed rental projects, which those are always hard because of the funding cycle in that program. You got to go really fast and you got to time it, and
Okay.
the city's got to work with you. And so it's always dynamic.
That's good. It keeps you young at heart.
I guess so. Yeah, old in looks and when I'm hard. Yeah.
Or you use AI to kind of create that false. But anyways, it was great to chat with you. I know that we could talk about this for a long time, but I appreciate that being really transparent on what was happening in the industry. I think we talk about from the perspective of industry, but I think it's really important for our listeners and viewers and anybody who is thinking about a home or knows someone who wants a home. It's just really to understand all perspectives on what contributes to housing. It's
Hmm.
not because it's one party who's asking too much, or it's not just one thing. It's a really complex solution. And I think we all have to really, the key is to all work together, whether it's government, whether it's policymakers, whether it's building code changes and industry to really have a seat together at one table to talk about so nothing is done in isolation,
Hmm.
which that's where the problem is
Yeah.
happening, right? Everybody thinks it's just one thing that we're doing, but 124 other items too at the same
Yeah.
time that's not one thing. So anyways, thank you so much for your time today and your expertise. It's been a real pleasure having you on the podcast today. And I'll just finish up saying thank you very much for joining us for this special episode of Measure Twice, Cut Once. I'm Wendy McNeil, Haven CEO. And I would also like to thank our sponsors of these podcasts. We have BC Hydro, BC Housing, Fortis BC, Trail Appliances, and Rami Films. And like any other project, you need a team to do a home. You also need a team to do the project and this podcast. So thank you much for joining us. We'll see you next time.